Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long discussion between a guest host and the author of a new book. This week, Nomi Prins, former managing director at Goldman Sachs and current senior fellow at Demos, talks about her book, It Takes a Pillage, Behind the Bailouts, Bonuses, and Backroom Deals from Washington to Wall Street. She discusses the book with Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Mr. Sanders, who was a U.S. Congressman for 16 years before moving to the Senate, is the author of the memoir Outsider in the House.
Well, let me begin by thanking C-SPAN for the opportunity to be interviewing Nomi Prins, who is the author of It Takes a Pillage, Behind the Bailouts, Bonuses, and Backroom Deals from Washington to Wall Street. When I was in the House for 16 years, I served on the Financial Services Committee, so I have some familiarity with this issue, and needless to say, I have been actively involved in it in the last 3 years in the Senate. Nomi, thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time to be here as well today, Senator.
Nomi, let's begin with a little bit of background about you. Where were you born, and what happened in your life to have you end up on Wall Street and write the books that you've written?
Well, I was born in upstate New York, in Poughkeepsie, right outside of Vassar College, where my father had at one point been a professor, and then he was working in research at IBM there. It was very much an IBM town at the time, and we were very much a mathematical type of family, a lot of work with numbers from a very, very young age. And I ultimately wound up going to a state school, to SUNY Purchase, a little closer to New York City, getting closer to Wall Street to some extent, where I studied mathematics. And I minored in music, but my father said math is really the way to get a decent living and find a job. And as it turned out, that was true, because ultimately that was what was being hired on Wall Street at the time. A lot of math and engineering and computer science were really the degrees that the street was looking for. And so what I really just wanted to do is move to New York, as you do when you graduate college. And I wound up getting my first job at Chase, Manhattan Bank, before it was part of JP Morgan Chase, when I graduated. Actually, before I graduated, even I was 19. I sort of did a transition.
You were 19.
Yes, I was, and I started there doing a lot of analysis and sort of computer work and numerical work on.
So what was wrong with you? Why, when others are partying and having a great time, did you end up on Wall Street?
I was way too serious. I think I was the oldest child in the family, and I think that might have had something to do with it. That sort of sense of responsibility and financial independence and everything else. I think I somehow wound up over there, and I figured I was only going to be there for a year or two and sort of work in musical theater or something else in New York instead. And as it turned out, I wound up staying there a very long time through a number of different firms. And I think it just became easy to some extent, with all of the hardness that comes with Wall Street and within Wall Street firms. You did make enough money to pay rent in New York City and everything else. Nothing like the kinds of sums that are being made today, but certainly enough to live on your own.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, you write your book, in a sense, as being in the belly of the beast, so to speak. You were there.
Yes.
So what impact on your views, on your life views about Wall Street, occurred as a result of your working for Goldman Sachs? How many years did you work for Goldman Sachs?
I was at Goldman Sachs for 2 years. It was the end of my career on Wall Street. I actually ejected myself from Wall Street after having been at Goldman Sachs.
And Bear Stearns you worked in as well?
And at Bear Stearns as well. I was over in London actually for Bear Stearns. I ran an analytics group there for 7 years. So that was really the crux of a lot of the work I was doing on Wall Street and internationally. And then I came to Goldman.
So what impact did your experience on Wall Street have on your views? What did you learn? You were on the inside. Most of us are not on the inside. What was it like?
One of the things you know on the inside and you learn on the inside is there is such a tremendously competitive environment, which there aren't a lot of other places, but in Wall Street, it's almost like you come in every single day, and the higher you move up in a firm, the more this is the case. Every single day, trying to figure out how much credit you can take for a particular trade, if you can beat someone on another desk or in another area of the firm. You actually race to the offices of senior management in order to be able to tell them what you did to take part in a certain deal or a transaction, and very much becomes this immediate type of an environment where if you don't do that, you don't succeed. And if you're someone who wants to try and succeed, you sort of get involved in this game. And I ultimately found that very distasteful and really quite empty. But the environment is very much like that. It's very intense from a gamesmanship and a power sort of play, as well as it's really like a military strategy almost every day going in. It's literally from whose name you put on an email first, to whose office you go into first, to who you tell about a certain trade before someone else knows.
Sounds a little like the United States Congress, but that's another story. But let me ask you a question I think that is on the minds of millions of Americans. Right now, we are in the most serious economic decline since the Great Depression. If you add up the number of people who are unemployed, underemployed, and given up looking for work, 17% of the American adult workforce is in that position. It is a disaster. People have lost their homes, they've lost their savings, they've lost their pensions, all because, in my view at least, of the greed of the people on Wall Street. Now, one of the first question I want to ask you is, some people say, well, nobody could have predicted this. My God, it just came out of the blue. It was just amazing, totally unpredictable. How do you respond to that?
It was absolutely predictable for a lot of reasons. One is that mentality in the street. The reason this crisis happened was because there was a desire to find products and to create assets within Wall Street that made money. And they don't really care. It doesn't matter to Wall Street firms what those assets are. It turned out that they created assets out of a small amount of subprime loans. And when I say a small amount, I look at it like it's an upside-down pyramid, where at the bottom point you have subprime loans. And 1.4 trillion of those were issued during 2002 to 2007. But what Wall Street does is it takes them and it creates new securities, this whole other band of securities. And from those, it can make fees, it can make trading commissions, and a lot of other profits. They made $300 billion just on creating securities out of these loans. Not on even trading them back and forth, just on the sheer creation of these securities during those same years. And then what they do is they take those securities, they borrow against them to create new ones and to merge and to acquire and to trade and to speculate. So it all goes upward. That's why this whole thing fell down. It wasn't that the subprime loans got wrong. It was that all of the securities and trading on top of them toppled over.
You know what? I think most people kind of scratch their head. And when they went to school and we learned about economics, you see somebody starts a business and maybe they sell automobiles, and maybe they sell clocks, maybe they sell shoes, maybe they manufacture these things. So here's my really tough question for you. What the hell do they do on Wall Street? What do they make? What do they produce?
Well, they produce assets that only have value because they choose to say that they have value. There is no sheer production.
How does that improve my life or your life or my kids' lives?
It absolutely doesn't, and that's a really good analysis of the street. The Wall Street exists, and particularly investment banks and the most speculative components of banks exist purely to create, to engineer. That's what they talk. It's engineering assets. It's not engineering a train track. It's not engineering a building. It's engineering something that only has value because they say it does, and it gets its value from that. I have a quote in my book, which is great, from the senior partner at Goldman Sachs who left the firm to actually go to Morgan Stanley and was quite senior there, who said it's one of the only, finance is one of the only arts that's basically, or science is predicated on the creation of absolutely nothing. And it's only by pushing that nothing for something throughout the system, because people continue to buy it, that this continues to churn, and you create these sort of upside down pyramids of risk and assets that don't truly have intrinsic value.
So at a time when our manufacturing capability is declining, when we've lost millions of good manufacturing jobs, our infrastructure is in major disrepair, we desperately need scientists to help us deal with illnesses, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing some of the best minds in the country going into a sphere of activity which produces virtually nothing that is useful to the ordinary person.
It is not useful to the ordinary person. It is purely the amount of profit. If you look at a company like Goldman Sachs, a top-tier investment firm, they pay almost 50% of their profits out in bonuses. In any type of production company or even retail company, the amount of money that's paid in terms of compensation is maybe 20% or 22%. So all of that extra fluff, all of that extra profit that's really just about moving transactions or really moving money back and forth goes directly into these extravagant bonuses and extravagant compensation structures. It doesn't go out anywhere. It doesn't even pretend to go out anywhere. It stays right there.
And it looks to me like we're developing two separate worlds.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the figure. I think it was like something like 40% of the profits in America are now being made on Wall Street.
Right.
Which is rather an extraordinary number.
It's an extraordinary number. Of course, in New York City, it's an even greater proportion of what revenue comes into the city. And it's an obscene number because it's really not predicated on the creation of anything. We're still talking about assets that pretend to have value and that are rated to have value. There's all these other agencies that work with Wall Street, like the rating agencies like S&P and like Moody's, and they come in and they basically stamp value by deciding that these assets are worth a certain amount or that they have a certain quality attached to them. They call it AAA. And if you call something AAA, it sounds really good. And investors buy it, and pension funds buy it, and states buy it, and individuals hear about it from their local bankers. And so basically this infiltrates the entire system.
I remember, I'm a member of the Budget Committee now, and we had Hank Paulson in a couple of years ago. And I said, Mr. Paulson, back in my state of Vermont, around this country, the middle class is in a whole lot of trouble. People are really struggling. People losing their jobs. Their income is going down. There's a growing gap between the very rich and everybody else. What's your sense of the economy? And he said, oh, the economy is doing really good. And year after year, I mean, this is really astounding and a bit aggravating. Year after year, we heard from the Bush administration that from their perspective, the economy was doing great. Now, explain to me how they could believe the economy was doing great when the middle class was collapsing and we were getting closer and closer and closer to the edge of a major global financial crisis.
Because for them it was great, and that's the problem. No, 2006 was the record year of bonuses on Wall Street, 2006. Now, between 2006 and 2007, foreclosures in this country, just between March 2006 and March 2007, foreclosures increased by 47%. So it isn't like there wasn't information coming in that would indicate there was a tremendous problem brewing. And it's not like someone like Treasury Secretary at the time, Hank Paulson, who had been a CEO of Goldman Sachs and understands numbers, could not have seen that. But the fact is Goldman and other firms were paying out record bonuses that year because they were manufacturing. As things were getting weaker, and they knew this, they were manufacturing an even greater amount of these assets because they sort of wanted to turn it all in and sort of take profits as much as they could, as soon as they could, because they actually knew things weren't going to continue to stay. Wall Street knew there was a less trading going on in some of these, which was why they were created more, these toxic assets, because Wall Street knew that the game might be up. And so they paid themselves well. They created these assets, and Paulson should have known this, the Fed should have known this, because on the other side of all of this was declining loans, was increasing foreclosures, increasing defaults. This was real data.
You know, I got to tell you, from my end of the street, so to speak, sitting in the Congress and hearing these guys talk, it's like they were living in another world, where you had Bernanke himself, who now chairman of the Fed, who for a while was the major economic advisor to the president. I didn't hear anything coming from these guys to say, wait a second, we got to do something, because if we don't act, we may have the collapse of finance in the United States and around the world. Where were they at this point?
Well, that's it. I don't think they were looking at this data, or if they were choosing to ignore it or to act optimistic because that served a political agenda, because you don't want to be the party in power when the crisis happens. So if you can sort of push along and sort of will it to not happen and sort of give this, and this is how I look at it from the outside, but give an optimistic spin on things, even with negative data coming in, you can sort of push it on to really the next guy or the next administration or the next Federal Reserve.
He almost got out.
He almost got out.
Almost
a few months. If it had happened just in the beginning of 2009, it would have changed. But the reality was all this stuff was brewing.
Talk about, for a moment, this whole business of deregulation. My understanding is that during a 10-year period, Wall Street spent about $5 billion pressuring Congress through lobbying efforts, through campaign contributions to deregulate, to do away with Glass-Steagall. et cetera, et cetera. What impact did all of that deregulation and allowing these mergers to take place have on the ensuing financial collapse?
Well, the repeal of Glass-Steagall was really the catalyst for what ultimately became, a decade later, the collapse. And actually what even became a few years later, some Enron and WorldCom and the other scandals that we like to forget about, because they were all predicated on the idea of merging and acquiring and banking institutions becoming not just bigger, which they were doing. There was a record merger spree as well, leading into the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which happened almost a year ago today, on November 12, 1999, was when Glass-Steagall was repealed.
And I voted against it.
And you
I voted against it. Let me make the record clear.
Well, not only did you vote against it, I think you also said that all of the things that would happen to consumers, to mergers, all of that.
I'm being a bit facetious here.
But it did happen.
Yeah.
I mean, all of the warning signs, unfortunately, came into fruition. And the reason for that is that when banks merge and when concentration changes so that the more powerful ones have more deposits and control more loans and control more actual capital, they can churn it, they can trade it, they can speculate with it because it is there. And so that's what ultimately caused the crisis, is that you had extra capital and extra access to consumers, that you could use real money and real loans and real assets and turn them into something that ultimately became a crisis.
All right, now I'm going to move you a little bit. I'm going to ask you a question. Here's an interesting question. During those years when I was a member of the Financial Services Committee, every year Alan Greenspan would come out. And after everybody rolled out the red carpet and God had walked into the chamber there, and you cannot believe me, there was, and Greenspan gave forth his libertarian philosophy that the best thing that we can possibly do is do away with all government regulation. And when you allow these guys on Wall Street to do anything they want, somehow this wealth, they're going to do all the right things and it's going to create great wealth for all the Americans. Some of us, of course, did not believe it, but unfortunately a majority of the people believed it. Now here's my political question for you, which is interesting, and I think maybe says a whole lot about our political system. The president who originally appointed Alan Greenspan was the first President Bush. And he was reappointed. Now, and the first President Bush was considered to be maybe a center-right type of politician. He was reappointed, and Greenspan is an extreme right-wing guy, by a liberal Democrat named Bill Clinton. And then you had, some years later, Mr. Bernanke is appointed by kind of a right-wing Republican named George W. Bush. And a liberal Democrat wants to reappoint him. Now, what's going on? People generally believe that there's a difference in opinion between a first Bush and a Clinton and a second Bush and an Obama. How does this happen?
Well, first of all, there hasn't been really a change in any of the regulations that come onto the financial world between any of those two administration changes. Unfortunately, we hope there will be some change now.
Let me back that one up, because she's raising a very interesting point, and maybe I speak as an independent here, who is not a Democrat or Republican. But what you're essentially saying, that while there are differences obviously every day between Democrats and Republicans, on these kind of key financial issues about how we deal with Wall Street and who's head of the Fed, there does not seem to be a heck of a lot of difference. Is that kind of what you're suggesting?
It seems like one of the least partisan things in Washington, because if you look at just the sheer regulations that were passed, the continuation of Fed chairmen under the changes from Republican to Democrat both times, there isn't a tremendous amount of difference. In fact, there was more financial deregulation done under Clinton than there was underneath the first.
Secretary of the Treasury then was
Secretary of the
Bob
Treasury.
Rubin.
Yes, who happened to have also been a co-CEO at one point of Goldman Sachs, which is a whole other issue, this revolving door from Wall Street, and it so happens from Goldman Sachs, into the presidency, whether or not there is a Democrat or Republican president.
And Paulson was also at
Paulson, who was, when I was there, he was my boss's boss. Right. Yes, he was head of Goldman Sachs, became Treasury Secretary. He was a Republican under Bush II, who was a Republican. But Bob Rubin, of course, was a Democrat under Clinton, who was a Democrat. But they were both for the same deregulation. You could have almost interchanged them at any point in time. Paulson and Rubin and gotten the same result.
Let's throw in Tim Geithner. Where was Tim in the midst of all of this?
Well, Tim, of course, if we talk about where he was in terms of the bailout and everything else, he was head of the New York Fed, which had a very tight relationship with Wall Street. It is through the New York Fed that first of all, most of the bailout money came, but also historically that has had the tightest relationship and a revolving board door between the board of the New York Fed and leaders from Wall Street. Right now, for example, Jamie Dimon has a senior position on the board of the New York Fed. He runs a large bank, J.P. Morgan Chase. He succeeded Sandy Weil, who was running Citigroup, which was, so there's this constant revolving door. And so if you're president of the New York Fed, you have perhaps the closer relationship to Wall Street than almost the chairman of the Fed, than even a Ben Bernanke would have.
Right, while we're on the Fed, jump into the Fed. Let me mention something to you. Last year, I had Ben Bernanke came before the Budget Committee, and this is during the whole bailout process and so forth. And as you know, and I want to get into this at some length, at the very least, we know that the Fed lent out over $2 trillion in zero-interest loans to financial institutions. So I said to Chairman Bernanke, I said, can you tell the American people who got the money? It's, you're putting their money at risk. Most of us would like to know, some degree of transparency, who got the money? And he said, and it was pretty amazing, he said, not going to tell you. Yeah. $2 trillion of money, and you're not going to tell the American people. By the time that day was over, we had introduced legislation to make him tell us. But talk a little bit about that. How can a head of the Fed say with a straight face, I'm not going to tell the American people where $2 trillion of their money at risk has gone?
Yeah, no, it was astonishing because I think at the same moment or a few minutes later, he said it would actually be counterproductive to tell people. And I remember the word counterproductive as how do you possibly get to that term? And I guess the reasoning, besides the fact there's a whole lot of banks who don't want that information disclosed because that would indicate how weak they actually truly are, even with the bailout and with the subsidies from the federal government. And I think Bernanke was basically using that face and trying to somehow justify it by saying, well, if people actually knew how weak their banks might be, we would have this catastrophic run on the banks. It would be breadlines 1933 all over again, and the world would totally collapse as we know it. And I think that, whether he believes that or not, because I personally think that had we disclosed this information from the get-go, from before the bailout became as expensive as it became, because banks didn't know what each other held, no one trusted anyone, and that's why credit tightened up. Had we actually had full disclosure of books back then, of assets back then, of what the Fed might have been looking at back then, we could have avoided spending a whole lot of money in this bailout. But I think by the time he got to that moment, he was so entrenched in the idea that if anyone knows what actually went on, it would create, it would create a lot of anger. But that, I think, was probably his actual worry, but he acted as if his worry is that it would create a run on the banks.
No, that's exactly what he did say. But I think, and by the way, we took that concept of the need for transparency at the Fed to the floor of the Senate during the budget discussion, and we won in a bipartisan vote, because I think it's very hard for the average member of the Senate or the average American to say, excuse me, you're putting $2 trillion of my money at risk and you're not telling me who got it? Maybe we need a 1-800 number. Everybody in America gets zero-interest loans, and you don't have. What do you think? Is that a good idea?
Exactly. If everyone gets zero-interest loans, we'd have a very different America. But I'll tell you one thing just on the back of that. The New York Fed actually is extending more money than and had more open plans to the banking system than the Fed. We're talking about the $2 trillion on the Fed's book.
Right.
Ultimately, there was about $6 trillion worth of facilities created, much of which went through the New York Fed's book, and they don't necessarily aggregate them all. So there's a lot of other stuff that's not even near being looked at.
And who knows about this stuff?
Some of it is, it's quasi-public, not what collateral has been posted and what banks have received how much money. That you are trying to get to the bottom of that information. But when those facilities were open, when they were created, it wasn't like there was a big media press release, but there is information that you can kind of see through the, digging through the websites. And I did that. I mean,
you can do it. You can write a book. Most of us probably.
No, you can't do it normally. There's nowhere you can go on the Fed website or the Treasury website and to say, what did you spend? Where did you spend it? How much is it worth now? When is it coming back? There is no report that exists like that.
All right, now let me ask you, I'm going to put you on the spot. You ready? All right. Based on his record as head of the New York Fed, and now, let me get to Bernanke. Do you think President Obama brought forth Bernanke to be reappointed to be head of the Fed. Do you think that was a good decision?
I think that Bernanke made a lot of mistakes during this whole crisis, leading up to it in terms of not looking at the information that other people could have looked at and that there were economists telling him about. But more than that, the Fed has the ability to reject mergers. The Fed has the ability to deny applications for banks like Goldman Sachs that are investment banks and Morgan Stanley to become bank holding companies, which makes them more publicly accessible to the Fed in terms of receiving funds or receiving any sort of subsidies or perks from the Fed. It's the Fed's job to be prudent about that. And when Ben Bernanke was in that seat, he didn't say for a moment we shouldn't have a merger between Merrill Lynch and Bank of America. He didn't say we shouldn't have a merger between Wells Fargo and Wachovia. He didn't say why are we backing Bear Stearns' assets in order to have them merge into JP Morgan Chase. He didn't say any of that. He didn't say, wait a minute, Goldman Sachs, you know what, you can't become a bank because you have too much risk and we don't want the government's money to back your risk. He was in the position to do that. That was one of his jobs. And he didn't do that. So I believe by not doing that, he's actually shoved a really big second coming of the crisis, maybe delayed it a little bit, but created a much less stable landscape than we even had before last year's crisis.
So you're not one of those folks who say, whew, thank God because of that decisive action in the bailout, man, we're over the hump now. Good times are coming. You don't accept that?
Right now there are some good times coming for some banks because they have federal capital that they can use to go back into taking risky positions and trading, and their stock is up and their profits are up and their bonuses are up. But in actuality, there's more risk and there's more consolidation and there's more power amongst a fewer group of banks than there was before the crisis. So was there a crisis averted? I think it was delayed. That's the way I look at it. I think there are other decisions that could have been made last fall that wouldn't have involved putting trillions of dollars of public capital behind that banking system without changing dramatically the landscape of that banking system.
As we speak, President Obama has indicated that those financial institutions that were bailed out, he's going to cut back very substantially on the kind of CEO compensation. But the other financial institutions like Goldman Sachs, they're running as quickly as they can back to before the crisis. Tell me about chutzpah, if you like. How do a group of people who caused this terrible crisis and suffering for tens of millions of people in this country, after getting bailed out by the taxpayers of this country, go back to huge compensation packages and bonuses, and go back to exactly where they came from? How do they do that?
They feel incredibly, ridiculously entitled to doing that. They go back to their offices, you know, great, crisis averted, let's go and make money, which they are. Goldman Sachs is on track to make $23 billion in bonuses that year. That's a couple more $1 billion than they made in the year before the crisis. They're actually doing better than they were before. And it's really this mentality of what we do here is intense and it's important and it's this moment and it's this trade and it's this transaction, and what happens on the outside, it's their fault. It's their fault for not being us.
You know, again, as an elected official, people sometimes criticize appropriately people in Congress for living in a inside the beltway mentality, not knowing what's going on. I could tell you that in my state of Vermont, all over this country, there is fury, yes. There is rage against these people, and apparently they're not interested on it.
They don't care because nothing has happened to them. The rage and the righteous rage of the public doesn't affect what they get paid, and it hasn't affected how they operate. They said at their last quarterly earnings, Goldman, they are going to continue to do what they do. They're very open about it. They're not even trying to necessarily hide this information.
All right, on that note, we're going to take a break with Nomi Prins, whose excellent book, It Takes a Pillage, explains, I think, to a lot of people what has happened in the last year and what's likely to happen in the future. We'll be back in a minute.
Afterwards, and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with Nomi Prins and Senator Bernie Sanders in just a moment.
Book TV, Sunday. 3 new books by and about Sarah Palin, including a book signing with the former vice presidential candidate and Alaskan governor. The Weekly Standard's Matthew Continetti on the persecution of Sarah Palin. And reporters Scott Conroy and Shoshana Walsh on Sarah from Alaska. Stephen Gillen details the transfer of power following the Kennedy assassination and LBJ's first hours as president. And the U.S. financial crisis on Afterwards. Nomi Prins, former managing director of Goldman Sachs, on It Takes a Pillage. She's interviewed by Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. Find the entire schedule online at booktv.org, including our 4-day holiday Book TV weekend, starting Thanksgiving morning.
Afterwards with Nomi Prins and Senator Bernie Sanders continues.
We're continuing our discussion with Nomi Prins, who's the author of It Takes a Pillage. Nomi, it seems to, I think, many Americans that we're living in a world deeply divided, in a nation deeply divided. You got a Wall Street up there. You use the phrase, a sense of entitlement. These guys make hundreds of millions a year, occasionally $1 billion a year. You got hedge funds operating. They're doing their thing. And meanwhile, you have the rest of the country, which has seen in many instances really deep declines in people's standard of living, increase in poverty, people losing their health insurance. So you got Wall Street and what we call Main Street. What's the connection between the two? Why does Wall Street get bailed out and get richer while people on Main Street lose their jobs and their health insurance and get poorer? What's that about, and how do we turn that around?
Well, I think for one thing, Wall Street has a tighter connection to certain people in Washington and much more money to lobby and everything else. And so there's more of a sense of keeping what they have and getting more. There's no such thing as an ethical Wall Street right now. There's no such thing as we're going to stop ourselves from making as much money as we possibly can because that is their
Let me interrupt
mission.
you just to mention this thing, which to me is kind of astounding, but that's the way it is. You might have thought that the people on Wall Street who caused this severe economic crisis, that's one of them. Yeah. One of these guys might have gone on TV and said, you know, Americans, I'm really sorry. Our greed got away from us, and I know all of the suffering that we've caused. I'm sorry, and we're going to change the way. I haven't heard that.
No, there's no contrition, there's no awareness, there's no connectivity to the rest of the country because honestly, the people that really run these firms have almost no contact. Like literally, they just don't have a lot of contact with real individuals. But the result of the crisis that we all saw last year and the bailout and just the decision to open a lot of federal funding and subsidies and guarantees and cheap loans and everything to Wall Street as if that would somehow trickle down to the rest of Main Street, it almost had the opposite effect. It kind of fortified the standing people in Wall Street and the banks that survived to kind of continue doing what they're doing. And meanwhile,
let me interrupt you to say that what you said is exactly true. The line I voted, I should be clear, I voted against the bailout, right. But the line was, this is not a bailout for Wall Street, this is a bailout for Main Street, and we're working day and night to save Main Street. But you don't agree with that assertion.
Well, not only didn't I agree with it back then, as you didn't, but I also don't agree with any of the numbers that we have shown that have legitimately indicated that this hasn't been the case. Credit did not loosen. In fact, when TARP was passed, and that was only one component of the bailout in the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, there was a little teeny piece of that act that also allowed the Fed to pay out more interest on reserve money that the banks were keeping with the Fed. So while the banks are getting money, they're actually incentivized to not do anything with it, while the Treasury Secretary and others are saying that this will somehow loosen credit for the American people. It didn't. Credit is tighter now. And as a result, unemployment is higher now. There's a direct correlation between credit, and I'm not talking about crazy credit and, you know, people sort of running uphill, but basically the idea of credit for small businesses, for medium businesses, for individuals, because once those companies can't make payroll, they close, they fire people, they have nowhere else to go. And also out of this crisis, the smaller banks are continuing to fail in sizable numbers. We've had 99 closures just this year of smaller banks, while the bigger banks are getting all of this capital. So even in the banking system, there's a wider gap. And those smaller banks feed a lot of the smaller loans and the smaller businesses and the individuals. So there's this total knock-down effect, really, of the bottom part of the country. And that's why foreclosures are now at a record quarter again, not last year. This year we're at a record quarter. This year there's more defaults. This year there's more delinquencies. This year people are struggling more.
This is after the bailout.
A year after the
Fed
bailout.
Intervention.
Yes, and unemployment, national unemployment was 5.8% preceding that period of the crisis last fall, and now it is almost 10%. And that doesn't even include the fact that in most cities and urban areas, 139 different urban areas have double-digit unemployment from 15 before the crisis. So not only has this crisis not helped Main Street, it's actually hurt Main Street. So the bailout has hurt Main Street.
All right. What do we do? What do we do to create financial institutions that are part of the United States of America, that don't live behind a wall of greed and selfishness and irresponsibility and illegal behavior? What do we do to have financial institutions play a role in providing credit so that entrepreneurs and business people can create real goods and services and create meaningful jobs? What would you suggest that we do?
Well, first of all, we have to look at the money that was given to the system, and because the government didn't put any strings attached to it, we actually have to start to attach some strings and say, you know what, you said you needed this, you said you were going to loosen credit, you didn't. Here's what you actually need to do. You need to take a proportion of your capital, and there's all this discussion now, and there should be about banks having more capital so that they can actually control their risk so that government doesn't have to come in and subsidize it. But at the same time, I think some of that should be divided out, and more capital should be given to those small businesses, and more capital should be made available, and renegotiation should be much easier. What's happening now is that not only is credit not loosened, but if someone wants to renegotiate a home that's about to be foreclosed upon and renegotiate their mortgage, you can't get anyone on the phone. The process is so exhausting and so cumbersome, and documents get lost because there's just no accountability along the way. Remember, these little loans became these many assets, and so up here, you can't even find where the actual deed was to a property. And I think you need to basically take a look at that and make institutions more accountable. And there's a good reason to do that now because they are sitting on capital funding. There's almost more of a reason now to come in and say, okay, look, you had yours, now here's what you need to do.
You use the word accountability. On Wall Street, that is a four-letter word, isn't it?
They don't like accountability, but it will never come openly. Lloyd Blankfein, CEO of Goldman, he's not going to come to Washington and be like, you know what? We're paying out $23 billion in bonuses this year. I'm going to cut that. I'm going to just cut it down to a measly $15 billion. And I'm going to give the rest of that money into some fund that's going to help small businesses, or some fund that's going to give credit or advisors, or pay for them to help people renegotiate their mortgages. I'm going to do that because I feel bad. That will never happen. And so it needs to be legislated. Somehow it needs to be legislated, and particularly because they have had public assistance. It should be easier now to ask more of Wall Street, given that it has received so much more from the standpoint of the federal government, even than it was beforehand.
Right. And I'll tell you, one of the things as a senator I hear a lot about, people literally can't understand how they're bailing out these financial institutions, and then they end up paying 25 or 30% interest rates on their credit cards, which in the old days used to be considered usury, but now is just the cost of their doing business. And
it's the fees on credit cards. It's these arbitrary fees that get slapped on checking accounts and savings accounts, even, and all sorts of things, because now it's really a byproduct of Glass-Steagall repeal to some extent, to go back a little bit.
Explain for a moment. I'm not sure all of the viewers know what Glass-Steagall was about, what the repeal meant.
Okay. Well, in 1929, we had a tremendous stock market crash in the United States, which was followed by the Great Depression. And in 1933, when FDR was the president, when he came in basically in 1932, but in 1933 took office, in the first couple days, what he did was he closed the banks because it was noted that it was the bank's fault. It wasn't like people spontaneously stopped paying. It was that credit tightened even back then. Speculation was rampant even back then. Products were being created with nothing inside of them back then. The same sorts of things were happening, and that was because banks could take the deposits of consumers, the deposits of the population, and borrow against them. It's called leverage on Wall Street, in order to speculate and trade, and they did. And so what Glass-Steagall was about was saying, you know what, you cannot have a financial institution that both has the right and the access to population deposits and makes loans to the population and have them use that to bet and gamble and speculate. That just doesn't make any sense. And particularly the federal government cannot possibly be able to back all of that risk. It's all kind of a black box. And so what Glass-Steagall did was it separated banks out. It said, you know what, if you want to be a bank and you want to deal with customers and get those deposits, you're a commercial bank, you go over here, we will back you. And the FDIC was created at the same time in order to back the deposits of consumers and of individuals in the United States. Investment banks, you know what, you are on your own. You can do whatever you want, well, maybe not totally whatever, although that has been what happened, but you can speculate, you can trade, you can do whatever, but you know what, we don't have your back. We're not going to back that risk.
The taxpayers are not going to bail you out when you fail.
Right, and that was just so logical, and the FDIC won't be there to back you or to insure your debt, which is kind of what they're doing now with Goldman Sachs and with Morgan Stanley. It just won't happen because it makes no sense. Because
and then we came to the 80s and the 90s, and people like Alan Greenspan and Bob Rubin proceeded to tell the Congress why that was Glass-Steagall was just a terrible, destructive idea.
Yeah, from 1995, 4 years before it repealed, I remember Robert Rubin was talking about this notion that we couldn't be competitive as a nation if our banks weren't allowed to do whatever it is they do, that the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act was antiquated, it was old, it didn't work in today's modern world of finance, and you just can't constrict these because we're going to be at a loss, actually. The United States will actually decline in sort of financial supremacy if we are not going to allow our banks to do what all the other banks are doing.
So the Congress, against my vote, repealed Glass-Steagall. What was the immediate result of that?
The immediate result was a wave of mergers. There were mergers that actually preceded Glass-Steagall, such as Citigroup and Travelers. There was an idea where insurance companies could be a part now of commercial banks, and investment banks could be a part of commercial banks, and everything started merging together. So there was a first wave of mergers that happened right after Glass-Steagall. And lobbying that year actually went down because lobbying was up the year before. Lobbying money went down, so that was a small temporary respite on that. But and then what happened is there was more consolidation for a decade of the banking industry, so that you went from a situation where the top banks had 20% of the assets and deposits to now the top banks have 50%. And so you just continue to concentrate the industry and concentrate it with more risk added to it. And now you have these banks using deposits again as capital to speculate and trade just like they did back in the 20s.
And that takes us to the issue of too big to fail.
Exactly.
And what too big to fail means is that if a huge financial institution goes under, it's going to take half the economy with it, and then thus the justification for having to bail them out. Now, it seemed to me, and I said this on the floor of the Senate, that if an institution is too big to fail, it seems to me that it's too big to exist.
Right.
But since the bailout, we have not seen a breakup of these large institutions, quite the contrary. I don't know, Paul Volcker, among others, has raised that issue. What do you think about this too big to fail? What should we be doing?
I think we should be going back to the current Glass-Steagall. We should be separating these banks back out again. We shouldn't have gotten from a crisis into a situation where there are now fewer banks controlling more assets in the country, which goes back to what the Fed was doing in terms of blessing those mergers. So we have a situation where we need to separate them out. We need to separate out, again, the consumer deposits and loans and assets from the speculative investment banking and trading. Because what we have right now, not only are those banks, the big banks, bigger. JP Morgan used to be just JP Morgan Chase, which had a lot of mergers in it to begin with, but then having achieved the acquisition of Bear Stearns, it adds a really risky investment bank. Washington Mutual, it adds a whole bunch of consumer deposits. So now it's this bigger animal floating on more risk, and that risk was what we saw in their profits last quarter. Again, no secret about this. The only reason they made money last quarter is not because consumers are doing better. Consumers continue to post losses because they continue to hurt. Where they made money was in trading. So I think we have to totally take that risk out of the government's responsibility to back, which means you have to break up these banks.
So if people want to speculate, they can go speculate, but they're on their own. But they're not going to get bailed out by the government. And if banks want to make loans to people, real people, we will back them up, is what you're saying.
And that makes so much sense, because you could, not only will you back them up, you will understand the risk. Right. You know exactly what you're dealing with. I don't think there's a lot of people in Washington who sit there and look at what an actual credit derivative prospectus or a transaction.
I can concur with that.
You don't, and it's complicated, and I think to some extent it's actually not as complicated as it's made out to be, but it's certainly arcane and to anyone who's not in the trenches, and that's why Wall Street gets away with creating a lot of the securities it creates. It uses that lack of understanding, I think, to its benefit.
Let me switch gear for a moment. I think the average American, after the bailout or during that period, wanted to understand how the crisis occurred, who was responsible for it, and how we hold those people accountable, who's going to jail, who is apologizing. we really haven't seen a whole lot of that. In fact, one of the issues that I fought for, was a real investigation, a PCORA. You explain to folks what the PCORA investigation was in 1932.
Well, in 1932, PCORA, who was an assistant DA in New York, basically was asked to undergo an investigation of predominantly the banks in New York.
By the Senate Banking Committee.
By the Senate Banking Committee, to basically look at what the practices of the banks that were happening at that moment contributed to the crash and contributed to the depression. And that was, and what he found was this idea of speculating on the back of nothing or on the
and he brought J.P. Morgan and these other guys right before.
J.P. Morgan ahead. And he basically really hammered them to explain exactly what their practices were. And exactly how they inflated value, and exactly what they used, what deposits or money they used in order to do that. And it was so clear from that, so clear that this was something that was a direct contributor of the crisis. It wasn't that, and foreclosures were high then too, historically for that period. But that wasn't the crisis. That was just a manifestation of what Wall Street was doing. The little individual home in Vermont or in Stockton, California, or wherever, the foreclosures on those are very, very difficult for the individuals. But they are not what brought the system down. What brought the system down is all of the speculation that the Wall Street, mostly investment banks, created on the back of those loans.
But the American people really have not gotten that kind of explanation of what happened. They haven't had the guys who caused this problem in front of the TV cameras answering hard questions, have they?
That's really a good thing to do. I mean, some of these guys have been in front of various committees, mostly talking about their bonuses. And there's a good thing and a bad thing about that. Certainly the bonuses are egregious, particularly now after the crisis and with federal funding beneath them. But if we just focus on the bonuses, we lose sight of the practices that actually contributed to the bonuses. So you need to do both. And I agree, it would be really nice if you even got these people in front to say they were sorry. But
but even in addition to that, I think the American people are owed an explanation of what happened, and then the understanding that the Congress is trying to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But what I think you're implying is these guys are moving very aggressively to bring us back to exactly where we were before the financial collapse.
Well, absolutely, because one of the things that contributed to them being allowed or being able to create these assets out of loans is that money was very cheap. Money was very cheap under Greenspan, actually, in 2001 and early 2002. As a result, you have more esoteric loans being given out because banks are getting this money cheap and they need to figure out how they get more out of it, so they extract it from subprime, or they extract it by creating an asset, or they find some way to create money from nothing or money from cheap money. And now we have the exact same situation. Rates are very low, and in particular the banking system is getting like 0 to 0.25% loans from the Fed. So we're in a recreation of that scenario, just on a much grander scale.
Let me ask you another question, changing gear again a little bit. There is growing, I think, interest in the Fed itself, which, as you've indicated today, is an enormously important institution, but a very secretive institution. You can argue that certainly at particular moments, Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Fed, is more powerful than President Obama.
He controls more money.
He controls,
he controls the ability to create money, and that is a very powerful ability.
Talk a little bit about the Fed. How does somebody like the chairman of the Fed get all of this power? What do we know about the Fed? Should there be more transparency in the Fed? And I have to admit that I am the author of the Senate bill, which calls for a GAO audit of the Fed to do all of these things. I'm a little prejudiced in asking this question. But I think whether you're a conservative or you're a progressive, as I am, people are just kind of shaking their heads that an institution with so much power can operate in so much secrecy. What do you think?
And also subsidize so much of a private sector, and reside in Washington. And I think to a large extent the Fed in this particular situation has totally overstepped even its mandate and even what it was designed to do. The Fed is supposed to, on a regular working day, control or basically set interest rate. It's supposed to set something called monetary policy. It's supposed to raise rates, lower rates, depending on whether or not money is easy or harder to flush into the general system, be used for credit, be used for businesses, or what have you. And they do that. It's also supposed to oversee these commercial banks. It's supposed to make decisions as to whether they are allowed to become bigger. If there are risks within them, it is actually supposed to go in and say something. The fact is it doesn't, because it has such a tight relationship with Wall Street, with the banking system, that it's almost like telling on your brother.
All right. Do you happen to know how many people there are on the Fed, how these guys appointed?
There's this 12 Federal Reserve banks. They're appointed, basically people are appointed through those banks. So for example, the New York Fed sort of appoints people from its back door, which is Wall Street, and therefore you have a board of the Fed, which controls to some extent how this money goes back to where they came from. To one extent, last year, Stephen Friedman, who was chairman of the board of the Fed at the New York Fed, where Tim Geithner was president, was at the same time on the board of directors at Goldman Sachs. So you've got your foot on the place that you can get money from, and you've got the foot in the door of the place that gets benefits from that.
There's another expression for that. It's called an enormous conflict of interest.
It is a tremendous from day one, the Fed was a conflict of interest. From day one, particularly the New York Fed. And the relationship is that the New York Fed is the most powerful of those 12 Feds. But from day one, that's a conflict. There should not be members of that board on the board who are in any way related to the banks that receive any kind of money from the Fed. Otherwise, call it a bank. Let it be a private bank. But don't let it have access to the ability to create public money.
Now, how do, in your judgment, these guys with so much power, playing literally with trillions of dollars, get away without the kind of public scrutiny? I made the point, that when you're on the floor of the Senate, you're fighting for $28 million. There could be a 6-hour debate. Oh, you don't need that money. It's only Meanwhile, very quietly, these guys say, oh, well, we're going to provide trillions of dollars in zero interest loans. No discussion. Nobody knows who gets it.
Right.
What's going on there?
Well, I think to some extent, and you're different, but at the time, I think there was an idea of, well, the economy is going out of control. It's spiraling downward. Something needs to be done. And for some reason, the Fed will know what to do. And so there wasn't as much questioning. There was so much debate over the bailout, over the $700 billion. And there wasn't any questioning at the time over what's been going on the Fed's balance sheet. And I think to some extent there needs to be, and certainly the auditing bills are the way to do that, and opening what they're doing to the public is a way to do that. There needs to be a required accountability to Congress because it's public money of the Fed, period.
How do you live in a democratic society where public officials are supposed to be held accountability without any kind of
knowledge?
Yeah.
It's wrong. I think what we've seen out of this scenario in particular is that the Fed should not be a sort of isolated, private, secretive organization. If it's going to be involved in huge raising of public funds in order to subsidize a private industry, it needs to publicly disclose what it's doing. It is bizarre that so much conversation is given over $28 million additions to help anything.
You almost think it's like a shell game, that we're going to have all these great debates.
Look over here.
Earmarks. I mean, there are great debates, literally,
right.
On the floor of the Senate about a $100,000 earmark that goes on for hour after hour after hour. And then you get trillions of dollars being lent out here with no discussion whatsoever.
At one point, the amount of money that the Fed had on offer to the banking industry was $8 trillion. Now it's $6. It is $6 trillion worth of open possibility. I'm not saying every bank has used all that. We don't know. But there is an open possibility of $6 trillion worth of money.
I mean, that's just
it's staggering.
It is staggering. That's the
and then you also debate over a stimulus package or of extending unemployment benefits or something. And the numbers aren't even in the same zip code.
All right, we're rapidly running out of time, but this has been a fascinating discussion. And I'm glad your father made you major in mathematics or something. It sounds like you used that background very productively. Why don't we conclude our discussion? Where do you think the President and the Congress should go? What would you like to see them do right now?
Well, first thing, I think they should have a real debate over this idea of too big to fail. I think by simply increasing capital limits and having these too big to fail banks be sort of watched better is not the way to go, because you're watching something you don't understand. I think we need to break them up, reinstate Glass-Steagall, make them smaller, and I think that will have the added benefit of reducing risk in the system, because then we know what we're actually dealing with. Right. And then you can control compensation, which is created out of the risk-taking and out of the bonuses that come from those profits, because you're subduing the risk in the system. And yes, bankers won't make as much money, but that's okay.
Nomi, we're running out of time, but I think the main point that you have made, maybe the most important point of many, many very good important points, is that we can't look at Wall Street as something separate from the middle class and working families of this country. That we can't continue a process where these guys live in their own world, do not invest in anything of productive value, while the middle class continues to shrink and unemployment goes up. That they've got to play a different kind of a role.
Exactly, and we can't make it up to them. That's the key thing. President Obama is talking about raising small business loan caps, and that is good. But if the banks don't want to extend the loans, it doesn't matter that the caps are higher. So there has to be an attachment, there has to be an actual legislative attachment to making this behavior occur.
All right, on that note, let me thank Nomi Prins for being with us. The book is an excellent book, and I can't think of a subject matter which is more important for us to be engaged in. Nomi, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Book TV, Sunday.